I often return to what I call the first wound, that mysterious moment when a child confronts an experience far too overwhelming for their fragile inner world. It does not matter whether the event appears trivial to an adult eye. What matters is the emotional intensity it imprints. The child does not understand, they only feel. And when they feel too much, they create a deep, invisible mark that lingers like a quiet vibration in the psyche. When I observe an adult reacting with fear, anger, or withdrawal, I do not see the present situation, but rather the shadow of that first wound, echoing through time as if it never fully healed. That echo shapes behaviors, expectations, and even the way we interpret another person's glance. As this early trauma forms, the mind constructs emotional defenses to survive. These defenses are not deliberate choices. They are woven unconsciously, like an artisan working in the dark. The child learns to avoid certain feelings because to them, feeling too deeply is dangerous. In adulthood, this lesson becomes automatic reactions, sudden distance, unexplained irritation, silence that lasts too long. You believe you are responding to the present moment, but in truth, you are reacting to an ancient threat that never found a proper language to be expressed. The reaction belongs to the past, not the now. Trauma rarely reveals itself openly. Instead, it hides behind disguises, shyness, perfectionism, chronic self-criticism, or an endless urge to control everything around you. These behaviors are not flaws of character, but strategies learned long ago to prevent emotional overwhelm. You may call them personality traits, yet I see them as remnants of a child trying to protect herself from pain she could not bear. Thus, when something in the present triggers these patterns, the reaction feels disproportionate, because it is directed not at the situation, but at the buried memory underneath it. Another truth I uncovered is that the body remembers what the mind represses. Long after the traumatic event has been forgotten, the body continues to respond with tension, racing thoughts, or a sudden collapse of energy. This is because repression does not erase emotion. It merely hides it from awareness. The unexpressed effect seeks a return, and the body becomes the stage where the unspoken story tries to be told. When you shake, shut down, or feel your chest tighten without reason, it is not weakness. It is the psyche knocking from the inside, asking to be acknowledged. You may wonder why certain relationships feel threatening, even when they offer affection. But I have seen that trauma reshapes the way you approach others. If love once felt unsafe, the adult unconsciously expects abandonment, betrayal, or harm. This anticipation creates a cycle. You prepare for loss before it happens, and your reactions often push others away, confirming your fears. The wound becomes a prophecy. What should be moments of connection become scenes replaying the original injury. Not because you choose it, but because the psyche seeks familiarity, even when that familiarity is painful. There is also the compulsion to repeat, a force I observed countless times, the unconscious attempt to recreate the traumatic situation, hoping to finally master what once felt uncontrollable. You do not pursue the repetition consciously, yet you find yourself in similar conflicts, similar partners, similar disappointments. Each repetition is the psyche's misguided attempt at healing, replaying the scene with the hope that this time perhaps the ending will be different. But without awareness, the pattern only deepens, leaving you confused about why life feels like a looping narrative of old pain. One must understand that the reactions you judge as irrational are actually deeply rational within the logic of the unconscious. When a current event resembles the past injury, even faintly, your mind assumes danger and responds with the same intensity it once needed to survive. This is why trauma distorts time. The body believes the past is happening again. The emotional charge of yesterday floods the present moment, making a small misunderstanding feel like a catastrophe. You are not overreacting. You are reacting to a different moment entirely. Yet, I have also seen that healing begins the moment the unconscious becomes conscious. When you trace a reaction back to the wound it belongs to, you create distance between who you were and who you are now. You reclaim the power that once belonged to fear. The past stops invading the present, and the present becomes a place where new responses are possible. This is the true work of understanding trauma, not erasing the wound, but integrating it so that your reactions no longer belong to the frightened child, but to the adult who finally sees, understands, and chooses differently. I have long observed that the mind does not eliminate what it cannot bear. It hides it. Repression is not a flaw, but a survival strategy. The psyche pushes unbearable material into the unconscious so that the individual can continue functioning. Yet, what is pushed below awareness does not die. It sinks, still active, vibrating beneath the surface, and every repressed fragment searches for a path back, returning through fear, irritability, or impulsive reactions that seem to appear out of nowhere. But in the psyche, nothing appears out of nowhere. Everything is a return. When an experience overwhelms a child, the mind seals it away, as if locking a dangerous object in a distant room. But the lock is never perfect. The repressed content leaks through small cracks, especially in moments of stress when the conscious mind is too occupied to maintain control. This is why a sudden wave of anxiety, an unusual irritation, or a mysterious sense of dread emerges without logical explanation. These are not overreactions. They are echoes of what was never processed, pieces of the past resurfacing in disguised forms. You may believe you have forgotten certain painful moments, but the unconscious forgets nothing. It stores every affect, every fear, every unresolved conflict, waiting for a chance to express what it was once forbidden to feel. This expression rarely arrives as memory. Instead, it manifests as tension in the body, recurring nightmares, patterns in relationships, or behaviors you struggle to justify. The mind hides the content, but the body continues telling the story. Repression divides the self. Awareness goes one way, the hidden wound another. I have seen many individuals treat these reactions as personal defects, as if something were wrong with their character. But these reactions are not signs of weakness. They are signals. The unconscious communicates indirectly, like a messenger delivering a letter without revealing the sender. A sudden fear, a strange avoidance, or a repeated emotional pattern is the psyche's attempt to speak in its own symbolic language. And while the individual may dismiss these signs as irrational, I see them as precise indicators of where the wound resides. Repression also shapes perception. You may misinterpret harmless situations as threats because they resemble the buried event. The unconscious recognizes patterns before the conscious mind does. A tone of voice, a gesture, a simple disappointment can activate emotions that belong to another moment entirely. This is why repressed trauma distorts time. The past and present collapse into one, and the emotional intensity of yesterday floods today. The person reacts not to the situation before them, but to the ghost behind it. At times, the mind attempts to strengthen repression by creating elaborate defenses, humor to avoid vulnerability, perfectionism to avoid criticism, workaholism to avoid feeling, or detachment to avoid pain. These defenses may appear admirable, even useful, but they exist to prevent contact with the hidden material. They protect the individual from suffering, yes, but also from growth. Repression builds walls that keep danger out, but they also keep life out. There is a paradox in repression. The more the mind tries to silence the unconscious, the louder it becomes. Symptoms intensify, patterns repeat, emotions erupt unexpectedly. The psyche insists on expression because healing requires acknowledgement, not avoidance. The hidden truth seeks the light, not to harm, but to finally be understood. Repression delays the pain, but it also delays the possibility of integration. And as long as the individual refuses to face what lies beneath, the unconscious continues its silent rebellion. Yet I have learned that when the repressed content is named, when a person dares to trace their reactions back to the wound they belong to, repression begins to loosen its grip. The unconscious no longer needs to shout through symptoms. The energy locked away returns to the individual, no longer disguised, but available for genuine emotional life. Healing begins when repression ends, and repression ends when the unbearable is finally allowed to be felt. There are moments when a small event in the present unlocks something far larger than the situation itself. A tone of voice, a sudden disappointment, a familiar expression. These subtle cues act like keys turning in a hidden door. The unconscious, always attentive, recognizes patterns faster than the conscious mind, and when it detects a resemblance to the original wound, it releases emotions that have been sealed away for years. This eruption feels immediate, as if the pain were being experienced for the first time, even though its roots stretch far into the past. What appears to be an overreaction is, in truth, the return of something waiting to be felt. This return rarely announces itself clearly. Instead, it arrives disguised as intense anger, unexpected sadness, or a sudden wave of fear that seems out of proportion to the moment. Freud described this phenomenon as the return of the repressed, where emotions that once had no permission to exist surge back with increased force. They are not new feelings, they are old ones wearing the mask of the present. The individual believes they are reacting to what just happened, but the psyche is responding to what once happened and was never resolved. The past crashes into the present with such impact that the two become indistinguishable. Sometimes this resurfacing appears through repeated patterns rather than emotional storms. A person might find themselves drawn to similar conflicts, similar relationships, or similar disappointments without understanding why. These repetitions are not accidents. They are attempts by the unconscious to bring the buried material into awareness. The psyche recreates situations that resemble the original wound, hoping the individual will finally confront what they once had to avoid. What looks like bad luck or poor judgment is often the mind reenacting an old narrative so it can finally be rewritten. The return of the repressed also explains why minor conflicts can provoke outsized reactions. A simple criticism may feel like a threat, a small rejection like a catastrophe, or a harmless mistake like proof of inadequacy. The emotional intensity belongs to the past, but the mind attaches it to the present trigger. This fusion creates confusion. The person knows their reaction is stronger than the situation warrants, yet they cannot control or fully explain it. The unconscious does not measure proportion. It releases what was held back, regardless of context. When these echoes surface, the instinct is often to push them away again, reinforcing the same repression that caused the eruption in the first place. But the return of the repressed is not a punishment. It is an invitation. The unconscious does not bring back old pain out of cruelty. It does so because the only way to dissolve what is buried is to allow it into awareness. Each resurfacing is a message that something unresolved is still shaping reactions, relationships, and decisions. The trigger is only the spark. The flame belongs to what was never given permission to burn out. I have long observed that the psyche, when confronted with unbearable material, does not surrender. It strategizes. Defense mechanisms are the ego's pragmatic inventions, ways of keeping the storm at bay so that life can continue. Denial, perhaps the most primitive, refuses to admit what is intolerable. When a painful truth would shatter the self, the mind simply acts as if it were not so. I have seen patients behave as though catastrophe had not occurred, not because they are dishonest, but because honesty would annihilate their fragile balance. Denial buys time. It preserves function until the ego is strong enough to face what was hidden. Rationalization is another tool the ego fashions to survive exposure. The mind constructs explanations that appear plausible, elegant even, yet they often serve only to disguise the real motive. A person will supply reasons that sound convincing because to acknowledge the true cause would be to admit vulnerability. I watched countless defenses replace confession with argument, turning painful impulses into respectable choices. The intellect, in such instances, becomes a loyal ally of avoidance. It wraps discomfort in logic, so the heart need not tremble. Displacement fascinates me because it reveals how the psyche seeks safety without ceasing to express its force. When an emotion is too dangerous to direct at its true object, it is redirected toward a safer target. Anger at a parent becomes outburst against a neighbor. Grief compressed into silence blooms as irritation at small inconveniences. The displaced affect still demands expression, and the ego, creative and stubborn, finds a new outlet. This redirection is not merely misbehavior, it is a wounded intelligence trying to keep the self from collapsing by casting its shadow where it will do less harm. Projection is a particularly revealing defense. The inequality one cannot accept is seen in the other. A man who fears his own envy will accuse colleagues of jealousy. A woman anxious about her desires will insist she is surrounded by temptation. Projection externalizes internal conflict, converting self-reproach into wary vigilance of the world. In the clinic, I frequently encountered this mechanism as a way patients preserved an image of themselves by ascribing their unacceptable parts to others. It is a painful but ingenious way the ego keeps its narrative intact. Then there is repression itself, the foundation of many defenses, a deliberate forgetting that is anything but passive. To repress is to exert psychic energy to push material out of consciousness. Yet this effort is costly. Repression secures the immediate safety of the mind while perpetuating the hidden pressure that later erupts as symptom. The paradox of repression is that it protects and imprisons simultaneously. It creates a reservoir of energy that, untreated, will seek release in dreams, slips of the tongue, or somatic afflictions. Sublimation deserves special mention, for it is the defense that most closely resembles transformation. Here the ego channels unacceptable impulses into socially valued activity, aggression into sport, sexual longing into art, rage into disciplined work. In my view, sublimation is the ego's noblest achievement. Not elimination of desire, but its elevation. Yet it too carries the mark of defense. Beneath the beauty, one still discerns the original need, redirected and refined. Sublimation does not erase the past. It redeploys it in a way that both serves the individual and enriches culture. Humor operates as a curious and humane defense. A wit that arises in the face of misery does not trivialize pain. It creates distance, permitting the subject to observe suffering rather than be consumed by it. I have seen patients who could only confess through laughter, whose jokes contained their most honest admissions. Humor allows the ego a vantage point from which it can survive the unbearable, and sometimes that survival is the first step toward change. It protects without complete concealment, offering a thread back to truth. Finally, one must remember that defenses are not moral failings, but adaptive measures. The ego builds them to maintain continuity under threat. The danger lies not in their existence, but in their rigidity. When the same mechanism is used in every circumstance, it calcifies into pathology. My work has always sought to render the unconscious conscious, so that defenses may relax their hold and the person may choose responses rather than repeat automatisms. Understanding the architecture of defense is the first step toward freeing the self from its protective but limiting constructs. I have often observed that the human psyche carries within it a peculiar drive, the urge to reenact what once wounded it. This compulsion to repeat is not a conscious choice, nor is it a yearning for suffering. Rather, it is an attempt by the mind to return to the scene of the trauma with the hidden hope of achieving mastery. When the original event overwhelmed the individual, the psyche seeks a second chance, a moment where it might finally prevail. Yet, tragically, these repetitions rarely lead to victory. Instead, they recreate the very conditions that once shattered the self. In clinical practice, I saw patients choosing partners who resembled those who had harmed them, entering conflicts that mirrored old childhood battles, or placing themselves in situations that revived forgotten terror. They would insist these choices were accidental or justified, never suspecting that their unconscious was guiding them back into familiar suffering. The past, unable to be symbolized, returns as behavior. When trauma refuses to be remembered, it demands to be repeated. This is not madness, but a desperate attempt of the psyche to transform unattended pain into something comprehensible. Many individuals interpret these recurrences as personal failures, yet they are manifestations of unresolved internal conflict. The ego, unable to integrate the traumatic experience, tries instead to restage it, as though repetition might offer clarity. But the unconscious does not differentiate between past and present. The old wound bleeds anew each time the pattern resurfaces. The repetition becomes a living echo, binding the victim to the first injury with invisible chains woven from fear, longing, and confusion. What is most striking is that the repeated scenario often contains slight variations, as if the psyche were conducting an experiment. Perhaps this time I will be strong enough. Perhaps this time I will not abandon myself. Perhaps this time the ending will be different. These attempts are not irrational. They are the mind's way of trying to rewrite a story it never completed. But because the true conflict remains buried, the individual enters the reenactment blind, inevitably reproducing the same outcome. The stage changes, but the script remains the same. Children especially demonstrate this phenomenon with great clarity. A child who has suffered rejection may seek out peers who treat him similarly, compelled to relive the despair in hopes of mastering it. Adults behave no differently, though they cloak their repetitions in the complexities of love, work, and responsibility. We gravitate toward what we know, even when what we know has caused us suffering. The psyche prefers the familiar wound to the unfamiliar possibility of healing. These repetitions also emerge in dreams, those nightly theaters where the unconscious stages its unfinished dramas. The dream returns the individual to the symbolic landscape of the trauma, offering a distorted but revealing portrait of the conflict seeking resolution. In analysis, when the patient begins to remember rather than repeat, the dreams often shift. The compulsion weakens, replaced by insight. This transformation marks the beginning of liberation from the invisible cycle. The task of therapy, as I conceived it, is to interrupt the compulsion by bringing its meaning into awareness. When the patient recognizes the pattern, the spell is broken. What was once enacted blindly can now be examined with clarity. The trauma, once unnamed, acquires language, and when the experience is spoken, it loses its tyrannical power. The past no longer commands the present through repetition. It becomes part of the individual's history instead of its destiny. Ultimately, the compulsion to repeat reveals the psyche's profound desire for healing, even when its methods seem self-destructive. It is the mind's attempt to resolve what was unbearable at the time it occurred. Only through conscious understanding can this cycle be dissolved. When the individual no longer reenacts the trauma but reflects upon it, the past ceases to imprison. What once demanded repetition can finally be allowed to rest. I have long maintained that true healing begins not with forgetting, but with understanding. When an individual brings a traumatic experience from the shadows of the unconscious into the light of awareness, the psyche performs an act of profound integration. This moment is not merely intellectual, it is emotional, visceral, and deeply transformative. The once fragmented event, previously buried because it was unbearable, becomes part of a coherent inner narrative that the ego can finally endure. In this integration, the trauma ceases to be an intruder and becomes something the individual can grasp, name, and eventually place in its rightful context. As I observed in many patients, the mind protects itself by repressing what threatens to overwhelm it. Yet repression also freezes emotional energy in a timeless state. This frozen material returns through symptoms, anxiety, and compulsions, insisting upon recognition. Integration is the moment when this insistent material is finally acknowledged. The individual recognizes that the overwhelming reaction in the present belongs to an earlier wound. Once this connection is made, the emotional storm begins to lose its power, for it is no longer mysterious. What was once a terrifying force becomes something comprehensible. The breakthrough often occurs when the patient allows themselves to feel what was avoided for years. Tears, anger, fear, these emotions re-emerge, not to torment, but to complete a process that was interrupted at the time of the trauma. The ego, now stronger and supported by insight, can finally tolerate what it once had to banish. In this encounter with the buried pain, the individual reclaims a part of themselves that had been left behind. This reclaiming marks the first step toward genuine mastery rather than repetition. I have witnessed how clarity reshapes the inner world. When a patient understands the origin of a reaction, why they panic, withdraw, lash out, or cling, they gain the ability to choose differently. Awareness is liberation. The unconscious no longer dictates behavior from the shadows. The individual begins to act from intention rather than instinct, from comprehension rather than confusion. The chains of the trauma loosen, for knowledge dissolves the illusions that once bound them. Integration also restores the unity of the psyche. The conscious and unconscious, once in conflict, begin to cooperate. Memories regain their rightful place in the timeline of life instead of erupting unpredictably. The patient discovers that they are no longer controlled by echoes of the past. Instead, they possess a new internal coherence, a sense that their experiences, even the painful ones, belong to a single, continuous self. This unity brings stability, confidence, and a renewed capacity for emotional connection. Often I found that dreams shift dramatically after integration. Nightmares lose their terror, symbolic images soften, and the psyche expresses newfound harmony. The individual sleeps differently, thinks differently, and relates differently. The trauma, now understood, no longer demands expression through fear or repetition. It becomes a memory, not a dictator. This evolution shows that the psyche has incorporated the once rejected material into its broader structure. One of the most profound signs of integration is the restoration of choice. When the trauma is unconscious, reactions feel automatic and uncontrollable. But when the individual grasps the origin of those reactions, they acquire the freedom to respond rather than reenact. They begin to see themselves not as victims of their history, but as authors of their future. This shift is subtle yet revolutionary, for it marks the moment where the self reclaims agency from the unresolved past. Ultimately, integration is not the erasure of trauma, but its transformation. The painful memory remains, but its meaning changes. The individual no longer asks, "Why am I like this?" but instead understands precisely how their inner world was shaped. With this understanding comes power, the power to heal, to grow, and to continue living without fear of being overtaken by what was once hidden. In this newfound clarity, the psyche discovers peace, and the individual steps into a life no longer governed by the wounds of yesterday.